So let's talk a little bit about watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is different from other paper in a few ways. First of all, it has something in it called sizing, which is basically either a gelatin, which is animal sourced, or a plant starch, depending on the brand. And what that sizing does is it allows the paper to absorb moisture more evenly. It allows the pigment in the paint to kind of sit on top of the surface of the paper so that it can reflect light more brightly and instead of soaking in and giving it a dull appearance. And it also lets you work the paint after it's dried. You can lift it off. You can kind of work with it a little bit longer. Watercolor paper comes in a couple different ways. You can either get it 100% cotton, and it will always say that it's 100% cotton when you're looking at it. If it doesn't actually say 100% cotton, then you can bet that it probably isn't. So I'm going to do a little demonstration of what that might look like on two different types of paper now. I'll put it over here, I've got Arches 100% cotton paper, this is cold press, and Strathmore 400, which is also cold press. And I'm using professional paint on both of these. So for this demonstration, we're just going to paint a simple leaf shape, and I'll be adding in some color as I go. We'll start on Arche. And now on Strathmore. Already I can see there's a little more patchiness here, and it's getting kind of a bead of paint that wants to sit there on the surface and run around instead of just evenly soaking right into the paper. Then I'll add a little bit of green. To one side. And that's on Arche. So let's take a look at these a little bit more close up. You can already see that on the Arche paper, it's blending into the previous layer of paint really quickly and nicely. You've got these capillaries of paint that are fingering their way across the paper as the paper fibers pull that pigment through, and you're going to get a really nice natural looking blend. Over here on the wood pulp paper, and they're both, the same thickness, they're both 140 pound, they're both cold press, but this paint is just sort of sitting there. If I want it to move, I'm going to have to kind of push it with my brush, and that's only going to add marks and make it look funny, and I'm just going to end up tinkering a lot and it will look overworked. I'll go back to the Arche, and it's already just doing the work for me. So when you use poor quality paper, your results are so much poorer, and you will think, what am I doing wrong? Is it me? Nope, it's just the paper. And when you invest in good quality paper, you will immediately see much better results. With the same paint and the same techniques, the same concentration of pigment, everything else the same, the paper is doing so much of the work for you. Even among 100% cotton papers, the texture and the absorbency of the paper will differ, so you're just going to need to play around and see what you like the best. But then after you've experimented a bit, I recommend finding your favorite, and this one's mine, finding your favorite and just sticking with it rather than paper hopping too much and hoping to find something less expensive that performs just as well. Honestly, your paintings will improve much more quickly once you find a brand that you want to stick with and just learn how your techniques work on it. Get used to how it behaves, learn how pigments move on it, watch how easily it lets you work with the paint, get a feel for it. Your skills will really take off once you settle on good paper that you enjoy using. Now we can talk about the surface texture or the press of the paper, because you'll generally see three choices when you're shopping: hot press, cold press, and rough press. Hot press paper is extremely smooth and it just feels like regular cardstock. There's not really any noticeable tooth to the paper, no texture to it. And it's actually made, all good watercolor paper is kind of rolled through cylinders in a mold in the manufacturing process, and the paper is pressed through these cylinders. And if these cylinders are heated, then the paper is treated almost like it's going under an iron. So it's pressed with really high heat and it flattens out the paper completely smooth. So that is called hot press. And in my opinion, hot press paper is not as easy to work with if you're using a lot of water in your painting, because it seems like the hot press paper doesn't absorb water as well. At least for me, it kind of performs like non-cotton paper. The water tends to sit up on top of the surface, and lots of watercolor painters say that it's easier to use this paper if you're painting wet on dry, if you're painting lots of small details, and if you're not painting lots of big washes with lots of water. So hot press is not something I tend to use. I tend to use cold press. Cold press is also made on those rollers of the cylinder mold, except that the rollers are cold when the paper is pushed through, and they're often wrapped in felt. And this creates a medium toothy texture to the paper, which you can see here. And rough paper has an even more pronounced tooth, so I'll show you that. And it's also made on the cold rollers, but then it's dried between textured blankets, which is very interesting, or sometimes it's air dried. A lot of landscape artists like using that because you can rub your brush over the bumpy tooth of the paper with the paint, creating lots of textural effects. Let me show you that right here. Because the paint catches those little hills and valleys, you can do this on cold press paper also. But rough press paper just does it a little bit more, and so you can get some texture to trees and rocks and bark and things like that. We'll also talk about the weight of the paper. This is 140 pound, and all that means, and it's true for the whole world of paper, is that they measure it by the weight of one ream or 500 sheets of paper. So 140 pound paper would weigh 140 pounds if you had 500 sheets of it. I also use 300 pound paper, and that's really thick. It's almost like cardboard. And that just means that 500 sheets of this would weigh 300 pounds. That's very heavy paper. And I use it because it can absorb a lot more water without warping, and it holds up better to scrubbing and lifting and making corrections without the paper pilling on you. I would say don't go any lighter than 140 pound when you're painting in watercolor. For classes, when I'm teaching, I usually use a block. Now that is the way that the paper is sold to you. There are different ways that you can buy paper. Pads, full sheets or loose sheets, and then blocks. And a block is just like a pad of paper, but it's been glued on all four sides. So you can see this has black glue all the way around it. And I actually have a video that I made earlier about how to remove watercolor paper from a block. So I'm going to include that right here for you to see. So they come, this is one that I just have waiting around, so I thought I would open it for you. And they come sealed in plastic. So the first thing to do is just take that off. And you can just, what I sometimes do is turn it over to the back and just use a sharp edge. And I carefully just make a slit from corner to corner. And that's really all I need to do, and then I can peel off the plastic. And then once you get it out of that, you're going to notice that it opens up like a pad, but the inside has a sheet of black paper on it. And I saw somebody recently saying, I just purchased a watercolor block and the paper is black. How am I supposed to paint on black paper? And that's an understandable question, because all around the edges it's glued with black glue. So it looks like the entire pad is black. But there is a space at the top that's unglued, and this is how you separate pages from this pad. The reason it's glued on all four sides is so that the paper will stay flat when you're painting and it will not buckle or warp because it's not loose. It's actually glued all the way around, and that's why they call it a block. So the way that you get the sheets loose, first you have to take the cover sheet off, and you just sort of pull away the black paper with your fingernail or with a palette knife or a butter knife or something, and you just get it under there, and then you carefully slit all the way around until you can remove it. It should go pretty easily. And then that sheet just comes right off. That's a piece of acid-free cardstock, and if you wanted to, you could use it. I sometimes cut them up and use these as black mats behind my focal image on a greeting card that I'm doing. So if I'm making a greeting card, I sometimes will use a black piece of cardstock there, and I sometimes save these and cut them up for that. But then you've got this beautiful watercolor paper ready to use, and again, after you have painted on it, then you're going to take, once it's dry, you're going to again find one single sheet, and you're going to stick your palette knife right in there and begin to slit that all the way around to remove it from the block. And so that's what's different about a watercolor block versus a pad, is that the pages are glued all the way around, but there is that little opening where you can slide a knife in and slip around the edge to loosen it up. I hope that's helped, and there's nothing to be afraid of with these. They are actually so convenient because you don't have to tape your paper to anything. You don't have to tape it to a board or stretch it or anything. It's just ready to use right there. So I love these. They are more expensive, but because I paint all the time, for me, they're worth it. In the next video, we're going to be talking all about paint, and that is a huge topic to cover as well. Professional versus student, tubes versus pans versus sticks, and I'll even go into my own organization and show you how I store all of my paints. So I look forward to seeing you then.